Good afternoon. I'm certainly honored to be here and speaking in front of the CIO Symposium. When Brad called me and indicated what he wanted to talk about or what we should talk about, I kind of slid this into three different categories. I want to touch a little bit about federal regulation and, frankly, the lack of and disclosure requirements, and again, the lack of as it relates specifically to cybersecurity. There might be a little confusion in terms of SEC regs, in terms of disclosure as it relates to that topic, so I wanted to address that a little bit. The other area was governance around cybersecurity, whether it's senior management governance or even at the board level. And we've seen within our firm, in dealing with our clients, a exponential and dramatic increase in board involvement, asking questions about the health and the resiliency and the maturity and the breadth, if you will, of their respective organizations' cybersecurity programs. And I think we've seen a transition from, hey, we've every year we have a penetration test done, and nobody's ever been able to get in, so we plant the flag of success, and we don't have anything to worry about. We must be fine. And through whether it's law enforcement discussions, whether it's what happened to Target, whether it's what happened to RSA several years before Target, one of the leading security companies, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, or most recently with Home Depot, it's clear that those organizations had pretty robust, mature, complex cyber programs in place, and they were still breached. So, what went wrong? And what we're seeing is boards starting to think about, maybe it's not so much how do I keep the bad guy out and get that paradigm out of my head. Well, not get it completely out of my head, but rather accept the fact that while we'll do what's prudently necessary to try and keep the bad guy out, if a bad guy actually wants to get in, he'll get in or she'll get in. The question to be asking today is not so much how do we keep them out, but rather if they do get in or when they get in, how do we detect it and how do we take action on it immediately so that we can limit our damages. And then the third area I want to talk about is what we're seeing companies start asking about and thinking about in terms of broadening their cybersecurity program. And it goes hand in hand with this notion that for years, companies really did sort of think about that hard, crunchy shell, right? Build the moat around the castle, and let's keep the barbarians at the gate and not let them get through the gate. But as networks are expanding and opening, and as more commerce is being done over the web, and as you need to connect with more business partners every single day, the idea that this hard, crunchy shell with a soft, gooey middle is going to be sufficient really is no longer the case. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're recommending companies think about when they go in and start really thinking about their cybersecurity program, and how do you look at it a little differently as opposed from the outside in, and maybe rather start looking at it from the inside out. So those are the areas that I wanted to chat on. The one thing I would really ask and request of each and every one of, I think these are so much more effective if it's a discussion and we get into a little bit of Q&A as opposed to me sitting up here and talking for 30 minutes and then holding questions till the end. So by all means, if you have a question, please interrupt me and let's get into a discussion about that topic, because I know it's always more valuable for the audience to hear that, to get into that kind of a rhythm as opposed to, this kind of droning on, if you will. So maybe starting first with SEC disclosure requirements, and maybe by a show of hands, how many people in here are representing public companies? Okay, so this is applicable to a very, very small number of you, so I'll try and hit over this rather quickly. But for those of you that are thinking about going public, or your management is thinking about going public, I think there was some confusion, particularly last year, when the SEC reissued guidance that they had initially issued in 2011 regarding cybersecurity disclosure requirements. And even the guidance that was issued in 2011, which is noted down in the bottom corner of the slide there really is no specific disclosure requirements that relate specifically to cybersecurity. So as you read through all of the guidance from the Securities and Exchange Commission, there's nothing that says specifically, if this cyber event happens, you must disclose this. Or if you are at risk of X, Y, or Z, you must disclose A, B, and C. So there's no prescription in terms of that. Now, with that said, there are disclosure requirements with it, whether it's in MD&A or it's in footnotes to the financial statements regarding operations, general risks, things of that nature that companies are responsible for disclosing. And what the SEC was trying to get across was that you should not ignore cyber events as part of those disclosure requirements. So, for example, some of the guidance that they had provided was, as you look at appropriate risk factors, and I would leave it to your SEC attorneys to help you understand what constitutes that. But in terms of appropriate disclosures in the areas as follows. The first is, do your operations give rise to material cybersecurity risks and the potential costs and consequences? So if you are a manufacturer of widgets and you're a traditional seller of those widgets in that you're selling maybe to a distributor and you have limited information systems that are involved in those transactions, I know your risks are going to be significantly lower in terms of having to disclose something. Now, if somebody were to have breached your network, actually got into your treasury system or got into your accounts payable system, which I have yet to hear of that happening in a company in America, but if somebody had done that and actually got cash out the door and there was actually a financial impact, well then clearly there's a requirement to disclose that. However, if you look at the business of a manufacturer that's selling widgets to a distributor, the risk of cybersecurity breach, frankly, is much lower than if you're a third-party data center or you're a service provider that's providing banking applications to mid-sized banks and small-sized banks. And if you're breached and somebody gets into those deposit systems or those loan systems, well, clearly there is a significant, there's a significantly higher risk to that organization, and the need for disclosure obviously rises because the impact to the financials is much greater. So looking at what your business, what kind of business you're in and the risk of a cyber breach to that business is really the first question that needs to be asked. Another thing that the SEC has asked is that you consider how you've outsourced either functions or technologies that in turn could increase the risk of a breach. Obviously, you still own the control environment, and or rather you have responsibility for the control environment, and ensuring that those third-party providers are in fact meeting what your requirements are. But that's just another aspect that can add to the risk profile of a potential breach. The third area regarding cyber incidents, they want them to consider not only incidents individually, which by themselves really may be immaterial. However, but if you've had a number of incidents, the aggregation of those incidents, what kind of material impact does that have on the financial statements? Risks related to incidents that go undetected for an extended period of time. I'm not exactly sure what they're trying to get at here because I'm not sure what company is going to disclose that we have insufficient intrusion detection systems or data loss prevention systems, because clearly you've just become a target to somebody that wants to go after something. But fundamentally what they're getting at is, does the company have sufficient processes and tools and procedures to in fact detect in a timely manner if and when a breach has happened, and then take action against that breach so that somebody's not sitting in your network for months and months. What's interesting, the Home Depot example is pretty interesting right now because the breach happened months ago, and the public's just being made aware of it now. And what really hasn't been answered yet is, when did Home Depot actually know it happened? Was it months ago and they've been working with the Secret Service on detecting what happened? Or did they in fact just realize it maybe a few weeks ago and slowly it's seeped into the news? But clearly this isn't something that happened a couple 3 weeks ago, and the method that was used in order to breach was through some malware. And it was disguised to look like McAfee antivirus software. So it's possible that, or it's not possible, it did happen months ago. It's possible that that breach, in fact, did go undetected for quite a period of time because it looked harmless. It's very similar to what happened to RSA. I'm sure a lot of people in here have those little key fobs. And if you're dialing into your network, you have to put the extra 6 codes in, or the 6 digits in for that code. So it's two-factor authentication, something you know, your password, something you have, this key fob. Well, RSA was breached. And the way they were breached was somebody sent, and you can imagine the training and awareness that a company like RSA probably puts out to their employees. I mean, if I'm RSA and we get breached, that's about as painful a public relations issue that I'd have to deal with. But what happened was somebody sent a resume into HR in a PDF file, and the employees were trained, do not open things from people you don't know. Well, it's HR, and they take in resumes, so clearly they're going to open resumes. And there was a little chunk of code embedded into the PDF, and it's scooted around the network, and the next thing you know, that algorithm had been defeated or identified. So again, it's these incidents that they happen and nobody knows they've happened because something innocuous came across and nothing seemed wrong with it. And then finally, and something that seems to be taking hold more and more these days is cyber insurance. I work for a nonprofit, or I sit on the board of a nonprofit down in Columbus. We do the Meals on Wheels program. We actually have cyber insurance. And the advice we'd gotten from both our attorneys as well as sort of our broker, not so much our insurance agent, but the broker, is that it's becoming more and more prevalent across the companies. So with that said, I mean, maybe just a quick show of hands. Has any other company, has anybody gone down the cyber insurance route? No? Oh, one? Okay. And how long have you had that in place? Okay. Okay. And did the insurance company come in and perform any kind of a risk assessment to sort of set, or did they just send a questionnaire and, yeah. So I think, not to go on a tangent on cyber insurance, but I think as more and more companies start recognizing whether you call it the need or the benefit of having that, our experience with it on that board that I sit on was they just sent a fairly simple questionnaire, and you'd say, yes, we do this, and off it goes, and then there's your rate. But it's probably not too far down the road that the insurance companies actually start sending assessors in and performing actual risk assessments and vulnerability assessments and starting to look at what kind of cyber maturity program do you have in place. So looking forward in terms of regulations, there really is nothing that we're hearing coming out of the SEC that says there is a pending disclosure requirement that's just 3 months away or 6 months away or a year away. I think that they feel that what is already documented as disclosure requirements sufficiently addresses cyber issues. The things that have happened, last year in February 2013, President Obama issued the presidential directive on cybersecurity, but that really was just targeted at what's considered the critical infrastructure, and specifically federal agencies that are responsible for the critical infrastructure: transportation, utilities, healthcare, defense, financial services, and banking, and things of that nature, and then industries or private companies that are in support of that critical infrastructure. And there's a list of those up here. I think every year there's probably at least anywhere from a half dozen to 3 dozen pieces of legislation that are introduced in the U.S. Congress or the U.S. House, or the House or the Senate, that is dealing with either privacy or cybersecurity. And they rarely get out of committee, and when they do get out of committee, they never pass, ever. They're always either weighted too heavily one way for restrictions on business, or they're not weighted heavily enough, and nothing has really come very close to passing that is a broad, overarching requirement for some type of cybersecurity rules in terms of business. Now, what you could start seeing a little bit more of, particularly with this administration, is agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Protection Agency, or the Consumer Protection Bureau that Richard Cordray runs now, issuing directives and rules, if you will, on certain behaviors, and trying to base it on some of these things here. Most of the federal legislation that's passed has really been very industry specific, starting with HIPAA. Everybody, I'm sure, has heard of HIPAA before. It's regarding healthcare information. HIPAA was actually initially passed back in the mid to late 90s. It was called the Kennedy-Kassenbaum bill, and it was intended really to accomplish 2 things. One was to standardize transaction code sets to make healthcare information passing a little more efficient. And then secondly was to address security and really to address privacy, but in order to address privacy, they had to have certain security regulations. Years and years went by, and nobody, I mean, people, particularly healthcare providers and insurance companies, worked on becoming HIPAA compliant, but there was not a lot of teeth behind HIPAA at that time because there was no one agency that had oversight responsibility for it. There was one that had responsibility for the privacy aspect, and then there was one that had responsibility for the security aspect. A couple years ago, HIPAA got a kickstart, if you will, when it was included as part of the High-Tech Act, which again was intended to really get at the information processing piece of the healthcare supply chain. But they also put some more teeth into the security and the privacy elements in that they put overall responsibility for HIPAA compliance inside an agency within CMS, or the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, called the Office for Civil Rights. And that office has begun outsourcing audits of HIPAA compliance to firms, frankly, like ours, and others, to go around and identify covered entities, everyone from the Cleveland Clinic or Kaiser Permanente to Aetna and WellPoint to John Doe dentist in the middle of nowhere, Montana, and perform audits of the security and the privacy regulations for those covered entities and then report back to CMS. And in the last year or so, those audits have been really more around, okay, here are the findings, what are you going to do to remediate these? But going forward, after another, I don't know, maybe 2 years, I think you can expect to start seeing fines levied against entities. And again, it's not just going to be large covered entities like a Cleveland Clinic or an Ohio State Medical Center or big insurance companies, but sole practitioner doctors and dentists and nonprofits like the one I serve on, which we run something called the Columbus Cancer Clinic. So we have to be HIPAA compliant. So that's probably one of the regs that's getting the most attention from companies that are impacted by that regulation. Another one is in the pharma space that's called 21 CFR Part 11, but basically any business applications that have a responsibility that have something to do with the manufacture of pharmaceuticals. There's certain controls that need to be in place for those applications around change management, around security, around data, or around backup and recovery and things like that. FERC-NERC, those requirements are not too uncommon to what the HIPAA requirements are. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, which has been around for quite some time, is really more of a privacy regulation that's in the financial services industry. But again, any time that you see privacy requirements or privacy regulations as our world becomes more and more automated and more digitized, the only way those privacy regs can be enforced is through security actions and security work. Sarbanes-Oxley, for the few of you in here that are public, there's clearly IT controls, and some of those are related to security. And finally, the other one that's probably the most common is known as FISMA, which is the Federal Information Security Management Act. And it dictates that any federal agency is following a NIST standard for information security, but it extends sometimes into state and local governments because they're receiving federal funds, or into private entities or corporations or companies if they have federal grants. Depending on what, how much and what that is, there could be a requirement that your information systems are in fact FISMA compliant. A lot of the cloud providers today that are actually selling into the federal government, Microsoft and Google, who have, or who are both trying to get email into the cloud and some of the Office products into the cloud because it's easier to manage and it's cheaper for those agencies. They have to be FISMA compliant in order to do that. So, are there any questions about regulations in general? Yes, sir. You're right. Yeah, so he had asked, within education, there's something called FERPA, which deals with the privacy of personally identifiable information within education. I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with FERPA. I just had a conversation with an East Coast university yesterday that has asked us to come in and do they want some penetration testing and vulnerability scans done. And one of the things they're challenged with, is I'm sure every single institution of higher ed, is this notion that, hey, we should be open, this is all about sharing information, which it is, but there's obviously elements of information that, in this case, are protected by federal regulation, or just in practical business sense don't need to be shared. So, if you're a private university, I don't think the students need to get in and see what the payroll schedules look like, or the salaries, or the finances, or certain research that may be on the verge of being patented. I'm sure you don't want to make that open to the world. So, there's this concept of trying to identify and risk rank your assets and figuring out how are your security controls going to be directed towards those. Any other questions about regulations? Just want to make sure I'm doing okay on time here. Okay. The other area was around governance. And as I had sort of said at the introduction, we're seeing more and more companies start to ask, and it's particularly boards of directors, indicating that they don't feel like they're having good, robust conversations with their CIOs, primarily due to something between intimidation and lack of understanding. And I guess that's which is driving the intimidation. But they don't know what questions to ask. And while CIOs often come in and they will present to the board at least annually, or if not maybe quarterly, and sometimes they may be presenting to the audit committee on certain risk topics, there's the research that we've done around this topic through our Audit Committee Institute shows that boards of directors, members of boards of directors do not feel confident with what IT is telling them. And the reason they don't feel confident is because they're really not sure what IT is telling them. They hear the words, but it just doesn't make any sense to them. So some of the things I'm not sure if, whether in your roles you have that challenge with senior management or even with boards of directors, or if private equity is involved and if they're asking questions, but one of the things that, at least as it relates to risk management, with cyber probably being that number one risk, is start explaining to those people asking that question what it is you're protecting against, right? So if you think about the tenets of risk management within information technology, there's this triad of protecting data, and either you're protecting it because it's confidential, you're protecting it because its availability is a high risk. It's always got to be available. It can't be down for a day or a week or a month. Or the integrity of the data cannot be called into question, like your financials. So what we're seeing be effective is IT directors, CIOs, IT leaders kind of talk to the boards about, again, from a risk management perspective, and specifically a cyber security risk management perspective, here's how we have looked at our assets within this organization from a confidentiality perspective, an integrity perspective, and an availability perspective. And we've identified these risks to those three tenets of risk, or we've identified these risks to those three tenets, and then here's kind of what we're doing about that, or here's what we still have to do about that. As you think about confidentiality, I've done enough work with manufacturers that they'll let us know that other than making sure somebody can't get into the email system, so they start shooting emails out to the public from the CEO or the CFO or under their names, and making sure payroll stays confidential, they frankly don't see a lot of confidentiality in what it is they have inside their four walls. They don't have intellectual property in these couple cases I'm referring to. Prices are fairly well known. Margins are fairly well known. And they compete more on service than necessarily price. They know what price has to be because of what their competitors are. So they really don't see confidentiality as a big deal, and they've communicated that to their board. And their board agrees with them because they went through and they talked about the various assets and said confidentiality is not something that we're particularly worried about. Availability, a little bit more so. Integrity was important to them in terms of making sure that the data that's going into build schedules and shipping and pricing and things of that nature, that was important. So they were thinking about controls from that perspective and what kind of risks could impact the integrity of data. They worried more about internal people and access that they had as opposed to some hacker who's coming in through the through some port, and then because hackers typically are not going to screw around with integrity of data. They're going after very specific targets, something that they can monetize, and typically going in and changing prices or changing formulas or things of that nature. We just don't hear about that much yet. Some of the other things that we see as effective from the governance perspective is the use of these dashboards. So again, based on sort of your confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad and the identification of what are those risks and threats to those three, we're seeing more CIOs start to develop dashboards based on results of vulnerability scans, results of pen tests, results of maybe social engineering exercises that they're doing, results of internal audits that they're doing, and trying to summarize those on a regular basis along with a whole number of other activities, control activities, into sort of a picture so that senior management can take a quick look and say, okay, I understand that we need a little work to be done here and here, and after a few conversations and a few months of going through these, they find it very valuable to see how risk is being managed within the IT organization, and their comfort level starts to go up quite a bit higher. And they start feeling comfortable asking more questions. To do that, obviously, the first thing is to identify those risks, right, based on your risk to confidentiality, integrity, and availability from a security perspective, but also some other IT risks in terms of performance, capacity planning, and things of that nature, maybe also considerations. Some of the other questions that we're getting from larger companies is where should information security actually reside? Historically and traditionally, still today, it resides in IT. And some people, and more times than not, I still think that works, assuming that the security person has some kind of a dotted line, whether it's to the audit committee or it's to the chief auditor or somebody that they can raise a flag if they have to. But moving it out of IT, often, the challenge is that you have leadership of that function now that doesn't technically understand the requirements to implement security measures, whereas within an IT organization you do. The other side of that argument is those protection measures may make it more difficult to do some of the other tasks within the IT organization, therefore they get squelched a little bit. I'm not sure there's necessarily a right answer or a wrong answer. It really is dependent from organization to organization. And then finally, as you start thinking about more and more cloud adoption, which will just continue and continue and continue into the next several years, questions need to be asked, and because your boards will be asking. That's the number one thing that's preventing movement to the cloud right now is, well, my information is commingled with my competitor, or my information is out there in the, out in this public cloud, and how do I know it's protected? So it's that one, probably first question that often needs to get answered, other than, is this cloud provider even able to meet our needs, and are they a real company, and not some guy running something out of his garage? But IT risks, and specifically cyber risks, continue to be that number one question that boards are asking about. So finally, the last topic is what we're seeing companies do in terms of looking at security a little bit differently. And again, what we normally would see, and historically what you'd see, is this focus on the network perimeter and making sure that only those authorized to get through the perimeter, in fact, can get through the perimeter. Once you're in, no big deal. We'll worry about that. Our only concern is somebody breaking in from the outside. And the fact is that like 90%, while these hacks, if you will, or these breaches are occurring from the outside, they're taking advantage of something internal. They're taking advantage of a weakness inside of the network or inside of the organization, and it's not necessarily a technical weakness. We're not hearing too many instances of somebody blew a hole through a firewall and got in that way. What we're hearing is, social engineering, and somebody gave up their ID and password. Bad security and awareness training. Malware that got in. Possibly bad patching, possibly bad antivirus technology. We're hearing about vendors that didn't meet security requirements that were either inside or outside your four walls, which is what happened with Target. It was actually through an HVAC maintenance company into their server, which happened to be connected to the whole network. There were weak controls on this. Who would think to look at that? They got in there, and boom, they were in the rest of the network. So what we're suggesting is that a new kind of paradigm, if you will, be adopted in terms of information security, and beginning kind of really up at the top here with leadership and governance, and making sure that the board and senior management is in fact in lockstep with what the risks to the organization are, and that they're going to dedicate the appropriate resources to address those risks. Really, secondly, then, is sort of the third one down, which is information risk management. Not all information is equal. There's a spreadsheet that has the college football pool on it. Well, who cares if somebody gets to that? But then there's the formula for, the new product that's coming out that's going to revolutionize lawn care, or that's going to revolutionize pharmaceuticals, or whatever. But something that is, massive investment into intellectual property, that clearly needs much different protection than this share drive over here that's got, personal spreadsheets and football pools and whatnot. So thinking about how are you managing the risk to information and identifying the crown jewels, if you will, within your organization, and then starting to work out from that. Because everybody already has sort of the hard, crunchy shell, right? That's done. There's very few companies that their network perimeter is wide open and anybody can just go sliding in there. So thinking about information risk management, then looking at both the operations and technology, what ops are necessary to protect that information, and what kind of technology measures are necessary, whether it's standards on operating systems or databases, or standards around web development protocols, whether it's additional technology that needs to be implemented to protect, like encryption, what kind of operations are going to be in place in terms of intrusion detection, incident response and management. And then obviously the supporting piece of that is the human factors that go into that, training and awareness of the users. Legal and compliance issues certainly need to be addressed. That probably is going to impact the information risk management piece. Do you have information that actually has to be protected via regulation? And then finally, business continuity, which if all else fails and all your good work still is somehow breached, how do you get back up and running within a reasonable amount of time? In terms of the, I mean, who in here thinks they've kind of looked at things this way as opposed to, hey, we've got a strong firewall, we've got some intrusion detection systems, you know, our perimeter is really strong, and what happens inside we're not so worried about. So either you want to keep it secret, or there's a lot of work to do. Let me ask this question. How many are getting asked questions from either board members, owners, or senior management, CEO, CFO, if you will, about IT risks in general? What is it typically around security, or is it a broader conversation than that? Mainly security. And yourself? So when you talk about what you're doing, I mean, do you get a sense that, you know, the people asking those questions, that they get it, or do they sort of walk away with a, you know, kind of a question mark, like they're sorry they asked the question? Okay, good. Okay. Any other, I think we're bumping up against our time. Yes, sir. Oh, Brad. Oh, I've got 5 minutes. I'm sorry. So with that said, any questions about these topics at hand? I think, yeah, the question was, do we see more long-term trends in terms of regulatory impact from the Fed? My personal view on that is it's going to depend on what type of administration's in the White House. You know, if we have a repeat of this administration, then my guess is you would see more regulation on business, and some of that probably will be cyber related. But I do believe it's still going to be focused more on individual sectors or markets as opposed to a broad overarching, because at the end of the day, that's got to happen through a passage of a law. And I'm not sure how long it's going to be before the White House and the Congress can actually pass a law together anymore. I think that in terms of any other regulation, it's probably going to be based on the impact of a breach. And at the end of the day, while these credit card breaches are pretty impactful to Target and to Home Depot, and then certainly to the customers, at the end of the day, they're a nuisance to the customers more than anything, because you're going to have free credit reporting. You're not going to be held accountable for those charges. So while it's a colossal pain in the butt to have to deal with those, nobody's really being financially impacted other than those companies. And then what will happen to both Target as well as Home Depot, as has happened with TJ Maxx, and then one of my clients down in Columbus, DSW, which had been breached about 8 years ago, they'll have to submit to a every other year audit by the Federal Trade Commission for 20 years. So for 20 years, the FTC will come in every other year, and generally they'll hire some firm to come in. They'll hire some either forensics firm or like a firm like ours to go in and conduct a cybersecurity audit and then report it back to the FTC. Yes, sir. Yeah. So the question was, do the boards that we're dealing with, do they understand the premise that it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when? And do they still think that, no, you can keep them out? My experience, and actually one of the reasons why we create, we call this our cyber maturity methodology. And one of the reasons we created this was through the conversations we'd had with board members, they were starting to get that. We were telling them, we'd go to audit committee meetings, whether it was for our audit clients or maybe it was, we were doing some kind of a special project, and we would talk about the notion of these pen tests. And the board would say, well, yeah, we have a pen test done every year, and the firm we hired, they couldn't get in, so plant the flag of success. And the fact is that when you hire a firm to do a pen test, and while I think pen tests should be done, and at least annually, and not necessarily from a third party, if you've got the skills in-house, there's no reason you can't take an employee and have them try and penetrate your network. But the reason that this false sense of security from an unsuccessful pen test, or successful depending on how you look at it, is that the people that you hire to do it are encumbered by time and by budget. You're only going to pay some firm so much money to try and do this, and typically with the number of firms out there doing it, you're not paying a whole lot of money. So they'll take a week, maybe 2 weeks, run some scanning tools, try a couple tricks, and see if they can get in or not. And typically when, these technical pen tests where you just try and, bust through the firewall or bust through a website, probably 95 out of 100 times or more, you're not getting in. So management thinks, great, they didn't get in. Well, I think if they could have tried maybe for another 2 weeks or another 2 weeks after that, like an actual attacker can, the results might be different. The other thing is companies often are reluctant to add sort of this concept of social engineering into their pen tests. So that's where you either, there's a number of little tricks you can, hey, I'm from the help desk, I need your password, something screwed up with your ID. You send phishing emails. You'd be surprised how often those work. Whenever we do social engineering exercises, we have about, like 10 tricks or tests that we execute as part of those engagements. And we are successful 100% of the time on at least 4 of those tricks, 4 of the 10 tricks that we do. So anytime we do social engineering, we get in. If we try a technical kind of brute force, not so often. But, and sorry, this is a long-winded answer to your question. We've told that story time and time and time again to usually audit committee members of the board. They're getting it. Because then they're going off, and now that they went to some cyber thing, and they heard some guy from the FBI, and he said the exact same thing. So now they're saying, well, we need to look at more, and that's kind of where that came from. Somebody else over here had a question. Yes, sir.
So I really wanted to offer an opinion more than a question, but it's around the regulation. So I'm from the Detroit area, and I lead up a statewide cybersecurity council in the state of Michigan for healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've got the ear of legislators in Lansing, and they're asking me, what do we need from a legislative perspective? And so far, I've told them nothing, right? Because I look at, I think some of the issues that we have out there today aren't due to lack of legislation. GLBA's been out there since, 2001. HIPAA's been out there since 2003.
Since like 97.
And I've worked in both sectors, and coming from banking and going into healthcare, I attribute one of the significant differences why healthcare is so much further behind is really a lack of enforcement of legislation.
Yep. Well, and that's a great point. So the comment was, some state legislators in Michigan asked, what can we do from a legislative perspective? And the answer is, well, really nothing. There's enough legislation. There's enough regulation. What there is a lack of is enforcement. And financial services has had an enforcement arm for quite some time. Healthcare is just starting to get one now. And it's really been in the last 2 years when they finally took the security and the privacy and merged it all under CMS, or this office inside of CMS, the Office for Civil Rights. I would agree with you that there is a lack of enforcement, and I'm not sure there's really a need for much more regulation, at least in those industries that kind of make up the critical infrastructure. There are FERC NERC requirements already. There's federal legislation for all of that, and most of the states have, you know, breach notification laws, you know, from a privacy perspective. So maybe, Brad, to your point, I'm not sure there's going to be that much more regulation or legislation. Probably just add-ons to what exists right now. Yes. Okay.
Comment on that. I'm in healthcare, and one of the things physicians usually respond about, you know, the security and HIPAA rules and stuff like that, is basically nobody's ever been caught doing this or doing that. Show me someone locally or someone who's been caught, and then I'll pay attention.
So the state of Utah, so here's your response to them. And this is a state government. So it's not a corporation, it's not, you know, it's a state government. They had one of the largest breaches of health information in the United States a year ago. They are going to be the heaviest fined entity since the new sort of HIPAA version 2, if you will, came on the books. And it will be in the millions. South Carolina had a breach as well. All right. All right, thank you.